There are secrets that governments bury not in vaults, but in the ocean floor, thousands of meters beneath the surface where no light reaches and no questions follow. In the final weeks of World War II, as WWII collapsed above ground and Allied forces closed in from every direction, something extraordinary was loaded onto a German submarine in the port of Kiel. Something so sensitive, so strategically significant, that only a handful of men in the entire Third Reich knew its full nature. The submarine was U-234. Its destination was Japan, and it never arrived. What happened in the North Atlantic in May of 1945 is one of the most layered, quietly unsettling stories to emerge from the entire war. Not because of the violence, not because of a dramatic sinking, but because of what was on board, who was carrying it, and what it means that so much of it still remains shrouded in carefully maintained official silence. This is the story of a mission that history almost forgot. A story that cuts to the very heart of what the final chapter of the Second World War actually looked like beneath the surface. To understand U-234, you have to understand the desperation of Germany in late 1944. By October of that year, the Wehrmacht was retreating on every front. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority. The Reich's industrial infrastructure was being bombed into rubble by Allied air campaigns that grew more relentless by the week. Hitler's war machine, once the most terrifying military force the modern world had ever produced, was grinding toward total collapse. But Germany still had allies, and chief among those allies was Imperial Japan, fighting its own brutal war across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Japan was losing ground too, but its military and scientific establishment was desperate for technology, expertise, and material that could shift the balance. Germany had things Japan wanted, and Japan had resources and a continued war effort that Germany believed could tie down Allied forces long enough to matter. The plan was to send a resupply mission, not a convoy. A single submarine packed to capacity with some of the most sensitive material Germany could offer a desperate ally. That submarine was U-234, a Type X B mine-laying submarine, one of the largest U-boats the Kriegsmarine ever produced. At nearly 90 meters in length, it was built not primarily for combat, but for transport. Its mine shafts had been converted into storage cylinders capable of carrying oversized cargo that no standard submarine could accommodate. In early 1945, German Naval Command began the process of loading U-234 for what was designated a diplomatic and military supply mission to Japan. The scale and secrecy of the loading process was unlike anything the submarine's crew had witnessed before. The commander of U-234 was Kapitan Lieutenant Johann Rick Feller, a veteran U-boat officer who had already survived more of the war than most submariners ever did. Feller was experienced, methodical, and disciplined. He understood that this mission was not a combat patrol. It was something else entirely. Something that carried a different kind of weight. The passenger manifest alone was extraordinary. U-234 carried several high-ranking German officers, Luftwaffe generals, and 2 Japanese military officials, Naval Captain Hideo Tominaga and Naval Captain Genzo Shoshi. These were not low-level diplomatic couriers. These were men of strategic importance, carrying knowledge and intelligence that both governments considered irreplaceable. But it was the cargo manifest that has fascinated historians, intelligence analysts, and investigators for decades since. Among the documented items loaded aboard U-234 were blueprints and technical drawings for advanced German aircraft, including the Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. There were drawings for the Heinkel He-162. There were components for acoustic torpedoes. There was advanced radar equipment and naval technology that Japan's engineers had been trying to develop independently for years. And then there was something else. Something recorded in the cargo manifest under a designation that would not be fully understood for years after the war ended. Uranium oxide. 560 kilograms of it. sealed in gold-lined cylinders and loaded into the converted mine shafts of U-234. The significance of that figure and that material cannot be overstated. U-234 departed Kiel on the 25th of March, 1945. It was one of the last major German submarine departures of the war. The journey was immediately difficult. The boat was overloaded, riding heavy in the water. Its 2 Japanese passengers were unaccustomed to submarine life, and the tension between the German crew and their passengers was present from the earliest days at sea. The world they had left behind in Kiel was already burning. Everyone on board knew that Germany's days were numbered. What they didn't know was how many days remained. For weeks, U-234 moved through the North Atlantic, running submerged during daylight hours and surfacing cautiously at night to recharge batteries. The Allied anti-submarine presence in the Atlantic by 1945 was overwhelming. Hundreds of escort vessels, patrol aircraft, and hunter-killer groups patrolled every major shipping lane. To survive, it all required patience, silence, and a measure of luck that was running out across the entire Kriegsmarine. Feller kept the boat moving. The crew settled into the grinding routine of submarine warfare. Time at depth. The smell of diesel and recycled air. The mechanical heartbeat of the engines. The careful rationing of everything, including conversation. And then, on the 4th of May 1945, a radio message reached U-234 that changed everything. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz had assumed leadership of the collapsing Reich following Hitler's death, and Dönitz had ordered the cessation of all hostilities. Germany was surrendering. The war in Europe was over. In the cold silence of the North Atlantic, deep beneath the surface, Johann Feller received that message and faced a decision that had no clean answer. What happens to a mission when the war that created it no longer exists? Feller called his officers together. The debate that followed has been described by surviving crew members as tense, fractured, and deeply uncertain. There were voices arguing for continuation of the mission to Japan, whose war was still ongoing and who remained a formal ally. There were others who argued that surrender was the only rational choice. The 2 Japanese officers, Tominaga and Shoshi, understood what surrender would mean for them. Under the traditions of the Imperial Japanese military, capture was not an acceptable outcome. Both men requested and received access to the submarine's medical supplies. Both took lethal doses of luminol, a barbiturate. Both men died aboard U-234 in the dark of the Atlantic before the boat ever surfaced again. Their deaths cast a shadow over everything that followed. Feller ultimately made his decision. U-234 would not sail to Japan. It would surrender to the United States. On the 14th of May, 1945, U-234 surfaced and raised the black surrender flag. It was met by the USS Sutton, a destroyer escort operating near the Canadian coast. The war was over. The mission had failed. But the story was only beginning. When American naval intelligence officers boarded U-234, what they found produced an immediate and classified response. The technical documents were extraordinary. The aircraft, blueprints, the weapons specifications, the radar systems. All of it was placed under immediate intelligence review and funneled into programs that would continue to shape American military technology for years. But it was the uranium that produced the most urgent response. 560 kilograms of uranium oxide. In a world where the Manhattan Project was racing toward its first test detonation was not simply an interesting footnote. American scientists and intelligence officers understood immediately what that material represented. It was examined, quantified, and removed. Its subsequent disposition has never been fully declassified. What happened to that uranium is a question that historians have pursued for decades. Some researchers believe it was absorbed into the Manhattan Project's supply chain. Others argue that the quantities and enrichment levels were not directly usable for weapons, and that it was processed separately. The official American records on this specific subject remain heavily redacted. The gap between what the records show and what they don't show is where the deepest questions live. The captured crew of U-234 were processed through standard prisoner-of-war procedures. Feller himself cooperated extensively with American interrogators and survived the war. His accounts of the mission, the cargo, and the final days at sea were documented and then largely buried in classified archives for years. The broader story of U-234 did not enter the public historical record in any meaningful detail until decades after the war ended. By then, several of the most sensitive documents related to the mission had been partially or entirely redacted. Why does it matter that so much of this remains classified more than 70 years after the war ended? It matters because U-234's cargo sits at the intersection of three of the most consequential events of the 20th century: the fall of Nazi Germany, the use of atomic weapons against Japan, and the post-war technological race that shaped the entire Cold War era. To understand fully what was on that submarine and where those materials went would be to understand more clearly how those events actually connected beneath the official narrative. And that is precisely what has never been fully permitted. In recent decades, researchers including Henry Shima and Carter Hidrick have published detailed analyses of U-234's cargo and its potential significance. Hidrick in particular, in his investigation titled Critical Mass, made the argument that the uranium aboard U-234 may have played a direct role in the completion of the American atomic bomb program. His research was meticulous and his conclusions were controversial, dismissed by some historians and taken seriously by others. What everyone agrees on is that the uranium arrived, that it was removed, that its processing was handled at the highest classification levels the United States government possessed. Everything after that point lives in the space between documented fact and officially maintained silence. U-234 target vessel in torpedo tests off the coast of New Hampshire. On November 20, 1947, it was sunk in the Atlantic. The submarine that carried the most sensitive cargo of the final months of World War II was deliberately destroyed and sent to the bottom of the ocean. Whether that decision was purely practical or whether it was meant to end something is a question no official document has ever answered. The human story of U-234 is easy to lose beneath the weight of the strategic and scientific questions, but it deserves to be held carefully. There were men on that submarine who had volunteered for a mission they knew was dangerous, not fully understanding how dangerous or in what ways. There was a crew that received news of their nation's total defeat while hiding beneath the surface of the ocean thousands of miles from home. There were two men who chose death over surrender, not out of madness, but out of adherence to a code of honor that their culture had built around them since birth. And there was a commander who made a choice in real time, with no guidance, no precedent, and no certainty about what any of the consequences would be. Feller's decision to surrender has been analyzed by military historians as rational, even pragmatic. But in the moment itself, in the cold dark of a submarine running silent in a war that had just ended without warning, it was something more personal than strategy. It was a man deciding what kind of world he wanted to step back into, and whether stepping back was even possible. The Atlantic swallowed U-234 in 1947 and has kept its silence since. The exact coordinates of its final resting place are known. The wreck sits in relatively deep water, beyond the reach of casual exploration, but within the range of serious deep-sea survey operations. No major expedition has been publicly conducted to examine it. No government has sponsored an investigation into its physical remains. Whether anything of material value could be recovered from a submarine deliberately sunk by torpedo attack is uncertain. Whether any of the secondary cargo that American intelligence did not immediately prioritize might remain in fragments at the site is a question that has never been seriously answered. The ocean is patient. It holds what it is given without judgment and without agenda. But the silence of deep water is not the same thing as the absence of information. It is simply information that has not yet been asked the right question. History is often taught as a sequence of clear events leading to documented outcomes. Wars begin, wars end. Weapons are built, weapons are used. Decisions are made, consequences follow. But beneath that surface narrative, there are always other stories. Stories that didn't arrive at their intended destination. Stories that surrendered before their final chapter could be written. Stories that were loaded with materials of world-altering significance and then sent to the bottom of the ocean before anyone could ask all of the right questions. U-234 left Kiel with the ambition of changing the course of a war. It ended its journey not in Yokohama, but in a classified American naval facility. Its crew prisoners, its cargo quietly absorbed into programs whose full history may never be made public. The mission never reached Japan, but the question of what it was really carrying and what became of it has never fully reached us either. Some things are hidden deep, not because they have been forgotten, but because someone decided a very long time ago that the bottom of the ocean was the safest place to keep a secret. And the ocean, for its part, has never disagreed.